Julian Thorne had always believed that power was inherited, not built. He had watched his father rule with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove, and he had decided very early that the silk was unnecessary. Why pretend? Why perform softness for people who were going to fear you anyway? The glove was inefficient. The iron was enough. That philosophy had served him extraordinarily well for 41 years. It had made him rich. It had made him feared. It had given him a name that made grown men straighten their spines when they heard it spoken in certain rooms. It had also, somewhere along the way, made him deeply, fundamentally incapable of seeing anything outside the radius of his own ambition. He did not consider this a flaw. He considered it a feature. Sentiment was a leash. Empathy was a liability. The men who built empires were not the men who stopped to consider the feelings of the people standing in their way. He had never stopped. Not once. Not for anyone. Naomi had understood this about him before she married him. She had been 24 years old and already possessed of a clarity about human nature that most people never develop regardless of how long they live. She had looked at Julian Thorne across a crowded room at a function she had attended for reasons that had nothing to do with him, and she had seen him with the kind of precise, unromantic vision that cuts through charm and arrives directly at character. She had seen the intelligence. She had seen the cruelty underneath it. She had seen the specific way his eyes moved around a room, cataloging, assessing, calculating value and threat level simultaneously and continuously, never resting, never simply present. She had seen all of it. And she had made a decision. Not the decision people assumed she had made. Not the decision of a young woman dazzled by power and money and the magnetic pull of a dangerous man. Naomi did not make decisions from her emotions. She made them from a place so far beneath emotion that most people did not even know that place existed in themselves. She had looked at Julian Thorne and seen not a man she wanted, but a structure she could use. An architecture of influence and resources and access that, in the right hands, could be turned into something extraordinary. She had decided her hands were the right hands. She had been correct. The 11 years that followed had been, by every external measure, the portrait of a traditional arrangement. Julian built the empire. Naomi kept the home. Julian made the decisions. Naomi made the house run. Julian met with associates and lieutenants and the various dangerous men who populated the outer rings of his world. Naomi poured the drinks and smiled the smiles and excused herself at precisely the right moment and went upstairs and wrote down everything she had heard before she went asleep. Every name, every number, every location, every arrangement that Julian believed was known only to himself and the men he had paid or threatened into loyalty. She had 11 years of files, 11 years of patience, 11 years of building something inside the walls of Julian's empire that he had never once looked at directly because he had never once looked at her directly. She was furniture to him, expensive, well-maintained, appropriately positioned furniture. She reflected well on him. She caused him no trouble. She asked no inconvenient questions. She was, in Julian's estimation, exactly what a wife should be. He had never asked himself what she thought about that. He had never considered that the woman who asked no inconvenient questions might simply have decided there was no longer any point in asking, because she already had all the answers. Camille had entered the picture 18 months ago, though her name had not appeared anywhere that Julian expected Naomi to look. She was young. She was uncomplicated. She looked at Julian with an open, uncritical adoration that Naomi had never offered him, because Naomi had never been capable of offering anyone something she did not genuinely feel. Camille felt it, or performed it convincingly enough that Julian could not tell the difference, and in the end the distinction did not matter to him. What mattered was that she made him feel like the largest thing in any room, and Naomi's steady, unimpressed gaze had long since stopped doing that. Julian had told her it was over on a Tuesday. He had been direct about it. He was always direct. He had stood in the doorway of the study with his jacket off, and his mind already moved on to the next thing, and he had told her in the tone of a man issuing a business correction that the marriage had run its course, that the house would remain his, that arrangements had been made, that she should conduct herself accordingly. Naomi had looked up from her work. She had said, "All right, Julian," and she had gone back to reading. The silence that followed had unsettled him in a way he would not have been able to name, and he had left the room without saying anything else, and Naomi had waited until his footsteps faded completely before she set down her pen and stared at the wall for exactly 60 seconds. Then she had opened the encrypted drive, and she had begun to prepare. The eviction came on a Thursday evening, and the part that lodged itself somewhere permanently in Naomi's memory was not the cold, though the cold was extraordinary, arriving off the open grounds with a force that moved through fabric and settled into bone. It was not the sight of her bags on the porch, arranged with a deliberate neatness that told her Julian had given very specific instructions. Not thrown, never thrown, because throwing would have been emotional, and Julian did not do emotional. It was not even the amber light glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the house she had spent 11 years quietly, invisibly running. It was Marcus. Her son was 9 years old, and he was standing very straight with his jaw set at an angle that she recognized, because she had worn that same angle on her own face for most of her adult life. He was holding his 7-year-old sister Isla's hand. He had positioned himself slightly in front of her, angled just enough to partially block her view of the lit windows, of the silhouette of the woman moving through her living room, of the shape of a man who was their father standing inside the warmth with a drink in his hand and his back to the door. Marcus was 9 years old, and he was already trying to protect someone smaller from a truth that was too large. Naomi looked at her son for a moment that she would carry for the rest of her life. Then she crouched down and she looked at both of them and she said, in the voice she used for everything, the voice that had never once cracked in front of Julian and would not crack now, "Sit on that bench. Keep each other warm. I need to make some calls. Do not go to that door. Do you understand me?" Isla pressed closer to her brother. Marcus nodded once, the way men nod when they have decided something, and he guided his sister to the bench at the far end of the porch, and he sat down beside her, and he put his arm around her shoulders. Naomi stood up. She turned away from the windows. She pulled out her phone, and the cold wrapped itself around her like a living thing, and she stood in it without moving, without shivering, her face completely still, and her mind running with the clean, frictionless precision of something that had been prepared for exactly this moment for a very long time. Julian was inside believing he had discarded dead weight. He did not know that the weight he had thrown out into the cold was the only thing that had been holding his entire world together. Naomi found the first name on her contact list. She pressed call, and she smiled. The bench was cold beneath her children, but Naomi did not look back at them. Not because she did not care, because she cared so completely, so ferociously, so far beyond the capacity of any word she had ever found for it, that looking back would have cracked something she needed to keep sealed for the next several hours. So she kept her eyes forward and her phone pressed to her ear, and she let the cold do what cold does, sharpen everything, strip away everything unnecessary, leave only what was essential. The first call lasted 4 minutes. She spoke quietly, the way she always spoke, in that measured, unhurried tone that had once made Julian tell her, early in their marriage, that she was the only woman he had ever met who sounded completely unbothered by everything. He had meant it as a compliment. He had not understood that it was a warning. The man on the other end of the call had understood her immediately. He always did. He had been understanding her for 6 years. Ever since the night she had approached him at a function Julian had brought her to and told him 3 things about his own organization that he had believed were known to no one outside his innermost circle. She had told him calmly, without threat, without any visible agenda, And then she had handed him a card with a single number on it and said, "When you are ready to have a real conversation, call me." He had called her 11 days later. What had followed was an arrangement so quiet and so carefully constructed that it existed in no file, no record, and no conversation that Julian had ever been part of. She ended the first call and immediately began the second. The second call was shorter, 3 minutes. The person on the other end said almost nothing, which was appropriate because the person on the other end never said much. They were not paid to speak. They were paid to move and to arrive and to have the kind of presence that rearranged the atmosphere of any room they entered. Naomi gave an address. She gave a time. She said, "Make sure the documentation is with you," and she ended the call. The third call was the one she had been saving. She had composed it in her head 100 times over the last 3 weeks, running through it the way she ran through everything, checking for gaps, testing for weaknesses, adjusting the language until it was precise enough to do exactly what she needed it to do and nothing more. She had never intended to make this call out of anger. Anger was Julian's instrument, not hers. She was making it out of something much colder and much more permanent than anger. She was making it out of clarity. The line connected on the second ring. She spoke for 6 minutes without pause, her voice never rising, her cadence never breaking, laying out information with the kind of organized, documented specificity that left no room for misinterpretation or deniability. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Then a single question. She answered it in one sentence. Another silence. Then the sound of someone reaching for something, a keyboard, a pen, the machinery of consequence beginning to move. "We'll need the files," the voice said. "They're already in your system," Naomi said. "They have been for 48 hours. She ended the call. Behind her, she could hear Isla saying something to Marcus in the small hushed voice children use when they are trying very hard to be brave. And she heard Marcus respond in the low, steady tone he had apparently decided was appropriate for the occasion. And the sound of the two of them together, holding each other up on a cold porch in the dark while their father laughed inside, moved through her chest like something physical. She did not let it move her face. She opened her contacts one more time. She typed a single line to a number she had never called directly, a number that belonged to a man who was not a friend of Julian's but had spent the better part of a decade pretending otherwise, and she sent it without ceremony. 4 words, no greeting, no signature. "He's all yours now." She put the phone in her pocket. She turned around and walked back to the bench and sat down between her children, and she put one arm around Isla and one arm around Marcus, and she felt their small bodies press into hers, and she looked at the front door of the house that Julian believed was his, and she waited. The door opened at 8:47. Naomi knew because she had been watching the time with the same attention she gave to everything, not anxiously, not impatiently, but with the focused awareness of someone monitoring the execution of a plan that had no margin for error. She had known Julian would open the door eventually. He was not a man who could resist the theater of his own cruelty. He had put her on that porch because he wanted to watch her break, and when enough time had passed without visible breaking, curiosity and arrogance would do what they always did with men like Julian. They would bring him to the door. He opened it with a drink still in his hand. He looked at her the way he had looked at her for most of their marriage, from a height he had constructed entirely in his own mind, with the particular expression of a man who had decided he was being generous simply by acknowledging your existence. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well. His shirt was open at the collar, and he looked warm and relaxed and completely unbothered. And standing behind him at a careful distance was Camille, wrapped in something that Naomi recognized as a cashmere throw from the living room, watching with large, uncertain eyes that suggested she had not entirely anticipated the reality of what she had walked into. Julian looked at Naomi. Then he looked at the children. Something moved briefly across his face that might, in a different man, have been shame. In Julian, it lasted approximately 1 second before his expression resettled into its default configuration of composed authority. "Naomi," he said, with the tone of a man who has decided to be reasonable, "it does not have to be this way. Come inside. We can discuss the arrangements properly like adults." He paused. "The children don't need to be out here." She looked at him. The wind moved between them, and behind her she could feel Marcus go very still in the way he went still when he was paying attention to something he did not yet understand. And she kept her face at its absolute most neutral, and she said, "We're fine, Julian." He blinked. "You're fine," he repeated, and she could hear the first faint note of something unfamiliar moving underneath his composure. Not concern. Julian did not do concern. Something closer to confusion. He had opened this door expecting tears or pleas or the specific trembling dignity of a woman trying not to fall apart in front of her children, and she was sitting on a bench in the cold looking at him like he was a mildly interesting problem she had already solved. "Naomi, come inside, you're being ridiculous." "I'm waiting for someone," she said. He stared at her. "Waiting for someone," he repeated slowly, and she could see the calculation beginning behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment, the first small thread of unease pulling at something he had been certain of an hour ago. "Who are you waiting for?" She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. And then headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. Not one set, three. Moving in the deliberate, unhurried formation of people who had all the time in the world, because they already knew exactly how this evening was going to end. Julian turned toward the lights, and Naomi watched his shoulders shift, watched the drink lower slightly in his hand, watched the first visible crack appear in the architecture of a man who had spent 41 years believing he was untouchable. She said nothing. She simply waited. The cars came closer. The three vehicles moved up the driveway with the kind of unhurried certainty that belongs exclusively to people who have nothing to prove and everything already arranged. No sirens, no theatrics. Just the slow, deliberate crunch of expensive tires on Julian's imported stone driveway, headlights cutting through the October dark like something surgical, illuminating the manicured grounds, the stone facade of the house, and the figure of Julian Thorne standing in his own doorway with a drink in his hand, and the first genuine uncertainty of his adult life written across his face. He had seen power arrive before. He had been the one sending it. He had never been on this side of the driveway. The first vehicle stopped, then the second, then the third, positioning itself at an angle that Naomi recognized as deliberate, blocking the secondary exit that curved around the east side of the property toward the service gate. Julian recognized it too. She could tell by the almost imperceptible shift in his weight, the way his center of gravity dropped slightly, the instinct of a man whose body understood threat before his mind was prepared to accept it. The doors opened. The men who stepped out were not uniformed. That was the first thing Julian would have registered, because uniformed men were a known variable. You could predict uniformed men. You could prepare for them, call lawyers, invoke rights, deploy the particular brand of arrogant composure that had gotten Julian out of official trouble on 4 separate occasions over the past decade. These men were not uniformed, and they were not his, and they moved with the quiet, economical precision of people who had been briefed thoroughly and had no interest in improvising. Behind them, stepping out of the second vehicle with a jacket despite the cold and a document bag that she held with both hands, was a woman Naomi had met exactly once, in a coffee shop 3 weeks ago, for a conversation that had lasted 40 minutes and covered, in precise and documented detail, the specific architecture of Julian Thorne's financial infrastructure, the shell companies, the asset transfers, the properties held in names that were not his but were controlled by mechanisms that traced back to him through a paper trail that Naomi had spent 6 years quietly, methodically constructing. Her name was irrelevant to Julian. What was relevant was what she carried. Naomi stood up from the bench. She felt Marcus's hand reach for hers in the dark, and she took it, squeezed once, firm and reassuring. And then she said quietly, "Stay here." And she felt him straighten beside her with that 9-year-old dignity that continued to undo her in ways she refused to show. And she walked forward across the porch toward the man who had put her children outside in the cold and gone back inside to laugh. Julian turned from the arriving vehicles and looked at her. "What is this?" His voice was controlled. Julian's voice was always controlled. But she had lived with that voice for 11 years, and she could hear, beneath the control, the specific frequency of a man whose certainties were beginning to shift beneath him like ground that had seemed solid a moment ago. "This," Naomi said, stopping a few feet from him, "is the part you didn't plan for." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the men moving across his driveway, then back at her. And she watched him do the thing that intelligent men do when reality stops matching their model of it. He searched for the explanation that kept him in control. The explanation where this was still a situation he could manage, redirect, absorb. Where Naomi was still the woman he had married. The quiet, undemanding, entirely manageable woman who kept his house and raised his children and asked no inconvenient questions. "Naomi," his voice dropped. This was his negotiating register. She knew every register he had. "Whatever you think you're doing, stop. You do not understand what you are involving yourself in. These people." "I know exactly who these people are, Julian," she said. "I introduced most of them to each other." The silence that followed was the most complete silence she had ever heard him produce. Behind him, Camille had retreated fully into the house, the cashmere throw pulled tight around her shoulders, her earlier certainty entirely dissolved. She had arrived at this house believing she was stepping into a ready-made life. She was only now beginning to understand what she had actually stepped into. The woman with the document bag reached the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Naomi with a brief, professional nod. Naomi returned it. Then she stepped to one side, clearing the path to the front door, and she looked at Julian with an expression she had been saving for 11 years. Not triumphant, not angry, simply clear. The expression of a woman who had reached the end of a very long patience and was now simply watching the inevitable arrive. "You should probably let them in," she said. "They have paperwork." Julian Thorne had built his identity on the loyalty of dangerous men. He had bought some of it and earned the rest through a combination of results, fear, and the carefully maintained perception that he was always the smartest person in any room he entered. Loyalty, in Julian's world, was not sentimental. It was transactional. It held as long as the transaction was favorable, as long as the man at the top continued to deliver what the men beneath him needed: protection, profit, and the assurance that the structure they were all operating inside was sound. The moment that assurance cracked, everything cracked with it. Naomi had understood this from the beginning. She had understood it better than Julian had, because Julian had always believed the loyalty was personal, believed that the men around him were attached to him specifically, to his name and his presence and the force of his personality. He had never fully grasped that they were attached to the structure, and that the structure, the real structure, the financial architecture and the information management, and the web of arrangements that kept everything invisible and functional and protected, had never actually been his. The men who came through the front door of the Thorne mansion that night did not look at Julian. That was the thing that broke him open, more than the documents, more than the warrants, more than the systematic and thorough dismantling that was already underway before he had fully processed that it was happening. The men who had eaten at his table and taken his money and used his name as both shield and weapon for years came through his front door and looked past him, looked through him. Looked with the calm and deliberate reorientation of people who had received new information and updated their position accordingly toward Naomi. His underboss, a man named Carver who had been with Julian for 9 years, and whom Julian had trusted with more than he had trusted anyone outside his immediate family, walked through the door and stopped in front of Naomi and said, simply and without any visible emotion, "Everything is in place." Naomi said, "Thank you, Carver." Julian stared at his underboss. Carver did not look at him. "What did you do?" Julian's voice had dropped below its controlled register for the first time. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man experiencing the specific vertigo of a reality that no longer matched any map he possessed. Naomi turned to look at him. She had promised herself she would not enjoy this moment, because enjoyment was not the point and had never been the point. The point was the children on the bench and the files on the encrypted drive and 11 years of a patience so complete it had looked, to everyone including Julian, like acceptance. She kept her face neutral. She kept her voice at its usual register. She gave him the truth because he had earned it, and because there was nothing left that concealing it could protect. "I didn't do anything to you, Julian," she said. "I built something beside you, you just never looked." He moved toward her then, and the movement was quick enough that two of the men near the door shifted their positions, a small and automatic adjustment that stopped Julian as completely as a wall. He looked at the men who had shifted. He looked at their faces. He read in them the thing he had never expected to read, not threat. Threat he could have processed. Threat was a language he was fluent in, but indifference. They had shifted to protect Naomi the way they would have shifted to protect an asset. Because that was what she was to them, not a wife, not a civilian caught in the crossfire of her husband's world, an authority. His authority had transferred. While he was inside with his bourbon and his uncomplicated mistress, and his satisfaction at having finally cleared his life of dead weight, his authority had transferred completely, and without violence to the woman he had left sitting on a bench in the cold with their children. "The accounts," he said. His voice was very quiet now. "Restructured," Naomi said. "The properties." "Redditled. The process began 72 hours ago." He stared at her, the offshore arrangements. She held his gaze and said nothing, which was its own answer, and she watched the last of something leave his face. Not just confidence, not just the arrogance she had lived alongside for over a decade, something more fundamental, the foundational belief that had organized his entire existence, the belief that he was the center, the load-bearing element, the irreplaceable thing around which everything else was arranged. He was not the center. He had never been the center. He had been the facade. She gave him the truth standing in the foyer of the house he had built, and she had run, surrounded by men who no longer worked for him and documents that proved it, with the sound of her children's voices drifting in from the porch through the open front door, and the cold moving through the house like it owned the place. She told him everything. Not out of cruelty, not to watch him suffer, though she observed his suffering with the clinical detachment of someone who had been prepared for this conversation for years. She told him because he deserved to understand what had happened, because ignorance was a mercy she had decided he had not earned, and because there was a version of this story where Julian Thorne spent the rest of his life constructing a false narrative about what had been done to him, and she had decided she did not want to give him that comfort. She told him about the shell companies first. 14 of them, established across 7 jurisdictions over the course of 6 years, each one holding assets that Julian believed were registered to him through intermediaries he trusted. He had trusted them because he had chosen them and paid them and in several cases frightened them into reliability. What he had not known was that the actual ownership structure of those companies, the layer beneath the layer he could see, ran through a series of agreements that bore Naomi's signature, not his. She had built a floor beneath his floor. When his floor was removed, she was still standing. He said nothing while she explained this. His face had passed through several configurations and arrived at something she could only describe as blank, the expression of a man whose internal processing had exceeded its capacity and temporarily shut down. She told him about Carver next. Carver had come to her 2 years ago. He had come to her because Carver, unlike Julian, was a man who paid attention to everything in a room, and Carver had been paying attention to Naomi for years, noticing the things that Julian had trained himself not to notice, the way information moved around her, the way certain problems resolved themselves in Julian's organization without Julian appearing to do anything, the way she always knew things slightly before she should have known them. Carver had come to her and asked a direct question, and she had given him a direct answer, and what had followed was a conversation that lasted 3 hours and restructured both of their understandings of the situation they were operating inside. Carver's loyalty had always been to the structure. Naomi was the structure. She told Julian about the documentation she had provided to the authorities, the files that had been sitting in the system for 48 hours before he had opened his front door, and arranged her bags on the porch with such deliberate neatness. She told him what was in them, the scope of what she had preserved and organized over 11 years of invisible, meticulous attention, and she watched comprehension arrive on his face like weather, slowly at first and then all at once. He had handed her everything she needed simply by being exactly what he was, arrogant enough to believe she was nothing, careless enough to conduct his empire in rooms he thought she was too irrelevant to understand, certain enough in his own indispensability that it had never once occurred to him to ask who was actually holding things together. When she finished, the foyer was very quiet. Julian looked at her for a long time. The drink was gone. She did not know when he had set it down. He looked older than he had looked an hour ago, not physically, but in some essential way, the way men age when the story they have been telling themselves about who they are is finally, irrevocably taken away. "You planned this," he said, "from the beginning." She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I prepared," she said. "There's a difference. I didn't plan for you to be who you are, Julian. I simply prepared for the possibility that one day, being who you are would become a problem I needed to solve." She held his gaze for one final moment. Then she turned toward the open front door, toward the cold and the dark and the sound of her children on the bench, and she walked back across the threshold of the house that had never been his, into the night that was already beginning to change. The house was quiet by midnight. Not the quiet it had been before, the heavy, watchful quiet of a place that belonged to a man who filled every room he entered with the awareness of his own authority, who made silence feel like something being withheld rather than something simply present. This was a different quality of quiet entirely. It was the quiet of a house exhaling, of walls that had held their breath for 11 years finally releasing it. Naomi stood in the center of the foyer after the last car had pulled out of the driveway, and she listened to it, this new silence, and she let herself feel it for exactly the length of time it took to confirm that it was real. Then she went to get her children. Isla had fallen asleep on the bench with her head against her brother's shoulder, her small hands tucked under her chin the way she had slept since she was an infant, completely surrendered to unconsciousness with the absolute trust of a child who believed, despite all evidence that the world could be unreliable, that someone was watching. Marcus was awake. He had stayed awake the entire time, she realized. Through the cars and the men and the sounds from inside the house that he had not been able to fully interpret, but had clearly been tracking with the focused, protective attention he had appointed himself to maintain. He looked up when she came through the door, and his eyes moved over her face with an assessment far beyond his 9 years, reading her the way she had always read rooms, looking for the thing beneath the surface. He found what he was looking for. Whatever he saw in her face settled something in him. His shoulders came down from where they had been braced around his ears, and for one unguarded moment he looked exactly his age, tired and cold and young, before he reassembled himself and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be steady, "Is it done?" Naomi sat down beside him on the bench. She put her arm around him and pulled him into her side and felt him allow it, felt the careful architecture of his composure soften against her, and she pressed her mouth to the top of his head and held it there for a moment before she said, "Yes, it is done." He nodded against her. They sat like that for a little while, the three of them on the bench in the cold, Isla sleeping and Marcus slowly, incrementally releasing the vigil he had kept, and Naomi looking out at the empty driveway and the open gate and the city beyond it, glittering and indifferent and entirely unaware that something significant had just finished happening on this particular patch of ground. She was not grateful that it had come to this. That was important to her, to be precise about what she was feeling, because precision had always been her instrument and she did not intend to abandon it now that the need for it had changed shape. She was not grateful. Gratitude implied that something good had been received, and what had happened tonight was not good. It was necessary. It was the conclusion of a process that should never have needed to begin, the resolution of a situation that should never have existed, the cleaning up of a man who should never have been allowed to become what he had become. She did not feel victorious. She felt finished. There is a particular exhaustion that lives on the other side of a long and necessary thing, and Naomi sat in it on the bench with her children and let it move through her without resistance, because resistance was for threats, and there were no more threats tonight. The exhaustion was clean. It was the exhaustion of someone who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down in exactly the right place. She carried Isla inside herself, her daughter's weight familiar and warm against her chest, the small hands still tucked under that trusting chin. Marcus walked beside her through the front door, close enough that his shoulder brushed her arm every few steps, and she did not comment on it, and neither did he. She took them upstairs and settled Isla into her bed and sat with Marcus until his eyes closed, which took less time than he would have wanted her to know. And then she stood in the doorway of his room for a moment looking at her son in the dark. He had held his sister's hand on that bench without being asked. He had stayed awake to watch over what he could not control. He had asked her, with the directness of someone who understood that the truth was less frightening than uncertainty, if it was done. She was going to have to think carefully about how to raise a boy who had already, at 9 years old, begun to understand the world the way she understood it. She was going to have to decide what to preserve in him, and what to gently redirect, and how to give him the clarity he had clearly inherited, without also giving him the weight that had come with it when she carried it. She was going to have to figure out how to let him be a child, while respecting the fact that he had, on a cold porch in the dark, already been something more. She had time for that now. That was the thing she kept returning to as she moved through the house that night, room by room, quietly and without urgency, the way you move through a place that is finally, actually yours. She had time. The specific, expansive, unconditioned time of a person who has removed the thing that was consuming it. No more management. No more careful, invisible maintenance of a structure built around someone else's ego. No more silence deployed in the service of a patience that had an endpoint she could not yet see. The endpoint had arrived. She went to the study last. She sat down at the desk that she had sat at for 11 years, and she opened the encrypted drive for the final time, and she looked at everything inside it, every name and number and document and carefully preserved record of 11 years of attention. And then she did what she had planned to do when this moment came. She initiated the transfer sequence she had built 18 months ago, sending the final set of documents to the final set of recipients, completing the last administrative act of a process that had been running quietly and invisibly beneath the surface of her marriage like a river beneath ice. When it was done, she closed the drive. She sat for a moment in the quiet study in the quiet house, and she looked at the window and the dark beyond it, and the distant lights of the city doing what cities do, continuing, indifferent, luminous. Julian was somewhere in that city tonight. She did not know exactly where and had not arranged to know, because his location was no longer information she needed. He had resources that she had not touched. She was not a woman who took more than was necessary, only what was owed, and what was owed was the house and the accounts and the structure and the future. He would survive. Men like Julian always survived. But he would do it without a name that meant anything, without the organization that had made the name, without the invisible machinery that had kept everything running while he stood at the front of it believing he was the engine. He would have to build something new. Without her, that would take him a very long time. Naomi turned off the light in the study. She walked upstairs. She checked on her children once more, standing in each doorway long enough to hear them breathing, and then she went to her room and she stood at the window and she looked out at the grounds that were hers now, simply and legally and completely hers, and she thought about nothing in particular for a little while. Just the dark, just the cold pressing against the glass, just the silence of a house that had finally learned how to rest. She had not saved herself tonight. She had simply stopped pretending that she needed saving. She got into bed. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in 11 years, Naomi Sterlingthorne slept without listening for anything.